Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back to my channel. And today, an episode of Critiquing Creationism. We've got carbon-14 and dinosaur bones? Really? And that's being censored. Yeah, you probably didn't hear about it because this work had been censored. It turns out this was censored about 10 years ago. I got all excited when I saw this article in Creation Ministries International yesterday. I thought, well, that sounds really interesting. I got to talk about this. This is big news. And so I did a bunch of some background research, and I went down a bunch of rabbit trails looking up authors and so forth, and kind of got my stuff collected, made a couple slides, which I'm going to show you in a moment. And I was just ready to present this, right? Just ready to record when it struck me. I was thinking about like the main author of this particular article is Carl Weiland. Carl Weiland is Ken Ham's old sidekick. All right. From Australia, back when they were in Australia, when they were just getting started with a creation ministry down there. And then Ken Ham came to America, then eventually went to Answers in Genesis. And he still had a relationship with Carl Weiland when he was with Answers in Genesis. And Carl Weiland was in charge of, or kind of like CEO of Answers in Genesis in Australia. Then they had a little falling out in the early 2000s, and eventually split occurred, and that's where we get Creation Ministries International. And Carl Weiland is still associated with Creation Ministries International. However, I knew that I had not seen anything written by Carl Weiland in quite a while. He's getting up there quite a bit in age, and he's retired. And so I was kind of shocked to see him actually comment on a recent news item. But of course, it's not really a recent news item. It's actually a 10-year-old news item because I got fooled by Creation Ministries International. I didn't look and scroll down to the bottom of the article and see that it said, originally published in 2013, republished on this date yesterday in 2023. So I thought I had some hot news, and I had some commentary I was going to make on this. Everything I'm going to say is still relevant, but what really hits me now, what really strikes me now, is that Carl Weiland and others really thought this was big news in 2013, and of course they've made these claims, quite a few times since, but really nothing came of this act of censorship by the secular organization. So what this article is about, we'll get to it in just a minute, is basically a report of a group of individuals who did carbon-14 dating on multiple dinosaur bones they had collected and sent them to labs that do carbon-14 dating, and sent them blind, right? Take one bone, take two pieces out of it, send it to two separate labs so you get two different dates, testing the accuracy of those. Don't tell the place how old you think they might be or what the source is, where they came from. And so you just get like their unbiased, like here's the amount of carbon-14 versus carbon-13 and carbon-12, whether the ratio's in there, and you just do your calculations and you get your estimate of the age of that particular bone. So they did this for 8 bones, and they collected that, and they got dates that were shockingly young. I say shockingly, but I am not shocked. Would not expect it to be millions of years old by carbon-14 dating, because carbon-14 dating doesn't work for old samples like that. But there is the question of, well, why is there carbon-14 dating found in these samples then? That's a legitimate question. And again, I'm not surprised that there's carbon-14 dates there. So we'll get to that in a moment. So I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, this is going to be a carbon-14 dating thing. I'm not going to go over it in immense detail because there's a bazillion videos out there, right? And there's a lot of videos that have debunked sort of young Earth creationists' misuse and misunderstanding of carbon-14 dating. And so I don't need to go over all that again. What I do have, and the reason you might want to stick around for a few minutes, is I'm gonna mix this. All right, I'm going to take this 10-year-old article. I'm gonna show you something that was said by a pair of very influential young Earth creationists, Andrew Snelling and John Baumgartner. Right, I'm gonna take what they have said just in the last couple days and contrast that with what's said in this particular article about expectations for finding carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. So that's the catch for this particular video. And it was the reason that I jumped on this video or this particular article, because I knew that video existed and I wanted to do a comparison. Okay, so without any further ado, critiquing creationism, carbon-14 in dinosaur bones? Question mark. Censored. We got that coming up next. Okie dokie, here we are. Let's make this preamble quick so I can get to the end of the video that I'm going to show you. Radiocarbon and dino bones. At the international conference result is censored, according to Carl Weiland. And I gave you the gist of it. Here we have this meeting of the Western Pacific Geophysics meeting in Singapore, August 13 to 17th in 2012. If I had read more closely, I would have realized this is not a new article, since why would you report on something from 2012, right? This was published in early or late 2012 or early 2013 on creation.com originally. They gave carbon-14 date results from bone samples from 8 dinosaurs, all gave dates ranging between 22,000 and 39,000 years old, right in the ballpark predicted by creationists. Yes, the ballpark. What do you mean, the ballpark? You mean it's closer to 5,000 years than it is to 65 million years? So the ballpark is tens of thousands of years, that's okay? No, that's not actually what they mean. I mean, because you might be thinking, well, shouldn't the carbon-14 data be 4,350 years old, since that is approximately the date of Noah's flood, according to Genesis and most other young Earth creationists? But they would say, no, they don't expect it to be 4,350 years. Mostly it's because they actually do believe that carbon-14 works, because it does work on contemporary samples, like samples we know the ages of, including samples that are 3,000 and 4,000 years old that we reliably have other ways to know what the dates are. And then we get dates from carbon-14 that are roughly in that sort of, speak to that particular age. And so it's hard to deny that carbon-14 actually works as a type of dating method. And since that stretches back several thousand years, they can't simply say carbon-14 dating is nonsense, it doesn't work. Now, that doesn't stop a bunch of some young Earth creationists from saying that very, it just, running with that and simply pronouncing that. But the young Earth creationists that really know what's going on are a little more nuanced, okay? So they have, what they have come up with is sort of this conversion table, all right? Carbon-14 dating is roughly the same. If you go 2,000 years ago, there was the same amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere being taken up, and the half-life of carbon-14 is the same, and they would agree has been the same for since the beginning of time, since God created the world. And so they're really talking about the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, which they say must have been much different in the past than it is in the present. That's how they could explain how samples that are only 5,000 years old look like they're 50,000 years old, because the changed ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12. This is simply an assumption. This is something that they have to build in. They don't really have I don't think, a strong rationale or actual evidence that the carbon-14 ratios were that far off in the past. They simply believe it must be true because the world must be young. And so that's how they can say that they predict that the carbon-14 dates will be tens of thousands of years old for dinosaur bones. Okay, so who are these people that presented at this meeting? They did present. I'll show you. Here's the a portion of the schedule. And on the schedule here at 1700, presentation BGO2 A012, we have a comparison of carbon and percent modern carbon values for 10 Cretaceous Jurassic dinosaur bones from Texas to Alaska, USA, China, and Europe, and then by a bunch of authors: Hugh Miller, Hugh Owen, Robert Bennett, Doug Wilder, Joe Taylor, you might recognize. Joe Taylor is a famous fossil hunter among young Earth creationists, and he has collected many dinosaur bones from many locations. So I'm sure he's one of the sources of their dinosaur bones. But I just highlighted Hugh Owen here because he's a kind of a well-known Catholic author and director of the Colby Center for the Study of Creation. And this is actually essentially a Catholic young Earth creationist organization, or has young Earth creationists in this organization. You're like, well, I never heard of that. Well, yeah, that's not very well known. I mean, because these are not exactly influential people, terribly influential people within Catholicism. But there is a hint of young Earth creationism or similar type style young Earth creationism in Catholicism as there is in the larger Protestant, modern evangelical Christian movement. All right, so here's what they were, here's what Carl Weiland is trying to gather from this. He's saying, look, here we have these people they presented. Oh, and I didn't tell you what happened. Where does the whole censorship come through? I mean, that's my big blaring censored going on. Where does that come from? After they gave their talk, there must have been a bit of a hullabaloo, about it because of their claims about there being carbon-14 dates of, these dinosaurs were only 20-some thousand years old. And even though they didn't directly say that, oh, they might have been alive at the same time as humans, it was very clear that they were of a creationist bent, and so the organization actually decided to withdraw the abstract, so it wasn't available anymore. And they claimed that it should have never been accepted in the first place, basically admitting that they have a sloppy peer review process and that normally they wouldn't have allowed that type of presentation to come through without more documentation or maybe evidence for their views. Now, I don't doubt that the actual presentation itself probably presented, they carefully prepped these samples and they tried to make sure there was no contamination, and they sent them to separate labs, and so they were blind, and it's just like, I'm not saying there's anything nefarious here. Now, this is basically, I'm going to call it a publicity stunt, a creationist publicity stunt. That's where creationists go into something knowing that they're going to create controversy, right? And in some ways, hoping that they get censored or hoping that people will say things against them so they can look like victims. And therefore go back to our audience and say, look, here we did this great work and it's being ignored. That's what Carl Weiland's here saying, right? He says, what all they're doing is urging their colleagues to do their own radiocarbon dating of dinosaur bones, because they don't do it. They just assume that there's no radiocarbon there. And so therefore they don't do the dating. And if they just tried to date with carbon-14, they would find that there's radiocarbon in these things, and not only these, but other types of fossils too, by implication. And therefore, they would discover that really the timeline, the Earth's history, is not nearly what we're being told. But as he says right here, they say the media should be encouraging scientists to do this also, presenting their findings openly, honestly, in similar conferences. Right? This would certainly be in the interest of scientific truth, right? Wouldn't you want to know? Why are you not testing dinosaur bones? Especially following the repeated findings of soft tissues in dinosaur bones, and now even seemingly irrefutable DNA in dinosaur specimens. Well, I don't know about the irrefutable DNA dino. I mean, that's not something that, like, all secular geologists believe that there's, or paleontologists believe that there's preserved DNA in dinosaur specimens. Yes, there are some reports of that. I myself am somewhat skeptical of some of those reports. I mean, I'm hopeful because I think it'd be really cool to find dino DNA, and I don't think it's impossible to find it. It's not like I don't think it's theoretically impossible that there could be some little tiny bits of DNA preserved under very special conditions, just like there is some portions of biomolecules, not soft tissue in the sense the entire tissue, because that's not what is actually being preserved here and what is meant by Carl Weiland here. I mean, maybe he knows that or doesn't know that. But yes, the implication though is, well, if there's soft tissue there, that's got to have carbon, and it can't be that old. So therefore, it's not surprising that there's carbon-14 there, because it was incorporated from the atmosphere when those tissues were made. And so, yes, it should be there. And the public has a right to know the actual chronology of the dinosaurs and indeed the history of the Earth. See, all this is being hid. It's a giant conspiracy. You get these huge meetings. You have you have a radiocarbon meeting. You have dozens, maybe 50 different articles and papers and talks given about the ins and outs of using radiocarbon and different things that it's been used on. But where are all the talks on dinosaurs and like all the other thousands of fossils out there that could be dated if we just tried to do it? No, we just want to hold the line that we already believe these are millions of years old and theoretically they shouldn't have any carbon in them, right? That's what it's set up here. If dinosaurs really were millions of years old, there should not be one atom of carbon-14 left in them. Now, I agree. If dinosaurs are 65 million years old, whatever carbon-14 was there in the original biomolecules of that dinosaur itself, there basically would be no radiocarbon left. There'd be no carbon-14 left of those original carbon-14 molecules that were present there at the beginning. So there's a couple different ways that there could be, because I do believe there is carbon-14. There would be detectable carbon-14 in a dinosaur bone. All right, just like I think there'd be carbon-14, detectable carbon-14 in any sample, essentially, that you would send to a radiocarbon lab and ask them to try to detect carbon-14. They're going to detect something there that looks like or is carbon-14, and therefore they're going to get a value. You're not going to get a value of 0, right? So listen to me again. There is carbon-14, right? The original carbon-14 that was incorporated into the organism when it was living and breathing, and therefore incorporating the carbon-14 that's in the atmosphere. It's eventually incorporated into plants, which eventually gets incorporated into animals in a relatively quick time period. And so whatever the carbon-14 is in the atmosphere, that's going to be the ratio in the body. Right? After 65 million years, you can do all the decay and you find out, yes, theoretically, shouldn't be any left. Just a couple quick numbers here, then I promise I'm going to show this other video. So there's approximately today about 1 carbon-14 atom per every trillion carbon-12 atoms in the present atmosphere. Okay, let's try to do a really quick little bit of math. And I don't want to do the formula. I'm not going to do that. We're not going to do the half-life thing. What I want to do is just like give you a perspective on why it's so difficult to measure, why there's a detection limit. For every 1 carbon-14 atom that's floating around in this room, there's 1 trillion carbon-12 atoms. So that's the ratio you're starting with, 1 to 12 trillion, right? That's 12 with 12 zeros after it. All right. That's a very small amount. So even to measure radiocarbon in today's world, as it is right now in you and me, right? That's a difficult task, but doable. We have some amazing instruments. What happens when it starts to decay? There's going to be less than a trillion. There's going to be less than 1 atom per trillion. It's going to be 1 atom per 10 trillion, 1 atom per 100 trillion, 1 atom per a quadrillion carbon atoms. Right? At some point, it becomes very difficult to measure the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12. It doesn't mean that there is no carbon-14 left. And so yes, after 65 million years, right? Even after, I have a calculation down here. I calculated the total number, in 1 gram, right, of atmospheric carbon, you've got 5 times 10 to the 22nd atoms, an enormous amount of carbon. How much of that is radiocarbon? About 5 trillion, all right? So 5 trillion. So you have about 5 trillion radioactive C14, all right, for within a gram of carbon. And you and I have many grams of carbon atoms in us, right? Got a lot of oxygen, a lot of oxygen. I'm sorry, we have a lot of oxygen, we have a lot of hydrogen, got a whole bunch of carbon. It's a fairly large molecule, and you got a lot of them. So imagine how many radioactive C14s you've got, right? You probably have 100 trillion or more in you. But now, of course, we're usually using tiny, tiny samples when we're looking at carbon-14 dating, right? Tiny little sample, much smaller than a gram, but we're still talking about there's going to be hundreds of millions potentially of carbon-14 atoms, if it's like today, present today. But that's still a ratio of every one of those per 12 billion. All right, I'm sorry. There's still just one of those for every 1 trillion carbon 12s that's in that sample. So yes, you and I have almost all carbon-12 and a tiny, 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 tiny bit of carbon-14, that tiny bit being trillions of them. So, so if you take those trillions, let's take the amount of carbon-14 in 1 gram, that 5 trillion, and ask how long would it take for all of that to disappear? I did the calculation for it to how long would it take to get it down to just 2 atoms left that are carbon-14 in 1 gram of carbon. Well, that's going to take about 312,000 years. And you're like, 312,000 years? And you still potentially would have a couple carbon-14s left. The thing is, it's beyond the detectable limit. That's why we wouldn't say that you could detect things out to 300,000 years. We say the limit is we can detect up to, with some reliability to 50,000 years, right? Some places would say maybe 60, possibly 70,000 years under special conditions. But really, no one's talking about measuring 200,000 years or 300,000 years or 400,000 years, right? At 65 million years, yes, theoretically, there shouldn't be any radiocarbon left at all. However, because it's way beyond the detection limit to find zero, you don't ever find zero. And you don't ever find zero for a couple different reasons. It's very difficult to get rid of every single carbon that is from the present day. Right? So if you have any present day carbon atmosphere that gets into your sample at all, you're potentially bringing in a couple carbon-14 atoms. All right. And if you have not very many there, I mean, you can detect a very, very tiny amount. And then you have prior samples. You have to clean the instrument. It's going to be very hard to get rid of every single atom potentially. And then you've got the problem of, and here's what I think is really the problem. You've got carbon-14 that's in those bones that is not from the original material, right? You have infiltration of carbon into that sample, either because there's been organisms decayed, bacteria, other organisms that bring in that. But that's not really what I'm concerned about. I'm more concerned about the natural production of new carbon-14 over time. If there's carbon atoms there, well, more importantly, if there's nitrogen, right, N14, which is everywhere, there are natural processes, because after all, that's how carbon-14 is produced, right? Cosmic rays and so forth coming down here in the atmosphere, hit the atmosphere, hit nitrogen N14 and convert it to carbon-14. So that's why it's always being produced new. Even though it's decaying, more of it's being produced and being replaced. But there are processes that occur in the soil, in the ground. There are radioactive elements that when they decay can cause nitrogen to be converted to carbon. And so you combine these things of, you've got instrument error, basically instrument sensitivity. And so even if there was absolutely nothing there, the instrument is probably going to pick up some kind of fluctuation that it's going to perceive as the presence of something compared to carbon-12, right? In that wavelength that it's looking at. And so you're going to get some value. And as soon as you get some value, the value is going to be, oh, the sample is way less than millions of years old, right? On the order of tens of thousands of years old. You combine that with contamination, combine that with carbon-14 that's actually been generated more recently in the sample, and you add all those things up, any person who runs a carbon-14 lab is going to tell you that you can send them a sample from any organism, from any carbon sample from any age, and it's going to have some carbon-14 detected. And the wavering of the instruments themselves and their inability to measure these extremely small amounts means that any measurement they get, it's kind of like using a yardstick and you're trying to measure your hair. And you're like, well, the smallest increment I got is 1 millimeter. And so it looks, like, is it 0? No. Is it 1 mil? It's closer to 1 millimeter. It's not actually closer to 1 millimeter, but it reads something. So you're like 1 millimeter. You're way off. But nonetheless, your measuring stick is incapable of measuring that tiny amount and seeing that. So if we had super precise instruments, you might say, well, potentially we could measure back to 300,000 years. But not really, because of all the other variables that go on. So I just went to, here's one C14 place, right? Beta Analytic. And they talk about here, what can they do? What their range is. For them, their range is from 43,500 years before present through the present day. And what they're measuring is they feel like they can only reliably, like, we don't really believe the data if it's less than this because of all these other variables, right? And so they say if it's 0.44 present, 0.44% of present molecular carbon levels. So present molecular carbon levels will be 100%, the level that it is today. And so 1% would be, well, 1 out of every 100 carbon 14s left. This would be, you've got 0.4, right? 0.4 carbon molecule per 100 carbon atoms. All right, so that's their detection limit. So if you go below that, if you get a value below that, that's the background noise, right? We don't trust any value below that. We can't really project out any further. As you can see, I'll just highlight that down here. Beta Analytic has sent graphite spits, right? Pure carbon, really fairly pure carbon, to the same exact graphite produced from Miocene-aged coal to as many as 7 different AMS labs, and obtain finite quotes of ages between 42,000 and 53,000, right? Not 30 million years ago, or even 300,000 years ago, right? Because you do that slope, and you're just like, no, it's all going to take hundreds of thousands of years to all decay. So why can't we get dates that are hundreds of thousands of years? We don't. We always get younger years. Okay, now, okay, that's all. Let's go to the video now. Let's hear what John Baumgartner had to say about carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. And remember, one of the key lines for this paper is that there shouldn't be a single atom of carbon-14 in these bones. Okay, so what we're looking at here, what we're going to listen to is a talk given or presented on the Logos Research Associates website. And this is a group of, we'll call them academic young earth creationists, because they all have degrees, right? Science degrees. And so these are 3 big individuals within young earth creationism. You've got Russell Humphreys, basically astronomy type stuff. He's up there in the upper right-hand corner. You've got Andrew Snelling over here, geologist from Answers in Genesis, on the bottom left. And on the bottom right, you've got John Baumgartner, who's famous for his catastrophic plate tectonics model of the flood. And he's the one that was presenting and will answer this particular question about the presence of carbon-14 in things like dinosaur bones. Let's give it a listen.
With this question from Geology for Fun. And this commenter asks, would radioactive minerals like uranium located near or transported by, in parentheses, the underground water flows, by fossil deposits create C14 in the fossils? So I think the question is, could there be another source for the C14 in the fossils?
Got it. Could there be another source of carbon-14 in dinosaur bones? That's really what the question is. Why might we actually find carbon-14 in dinosaur bones? Because in John Baumgartner's talk earlier, he's talking about how we find relatively young dates in a variety of different things that Other people say should be millions of years old and there shouldn't be any present. So why do we find that carbon-14 there?
Fossils as opposed to radiation from the atmosphere and so forth. I'll put the question up here on the screen.
I think John has the answer for that.
Yes, my answer is yes. I believe, a good example of that process is the fact that dinosaur bones tend to be radioactive, tend to have high levels of uranium in them. And
got that? Dinosaur bones tend to have a high amount of uranium in them. So they're deposited in places where there might be uranium in the soil. They're going to be radioactive. Radioactive uranium, when it decays, gives off, a particle that gives off energy that can convert nitrogen-14 into carbon-14. So brand new carbon-14 can be made in a dinosaur bone long after that creature died. New carbon-14 can be appearing in dinosaur bones. And by extension, we could say in a lot of other things too. That's going to create a background signal of carbon-14 that, if there's enough of it, can be read by the instrument. So you got your instrument error to begin with, all right, inability to completely clean it, and all these other factors that lead to there's going to be some signal. And then you add a tiny bit more signal from actual native carbon-14 that's in the dinosaur bones that wasn't there in the original organism. How can you say that there is still carbon-14 present from the original organism when you're just admitting that carbon-14 can be created in dinosaur bones at a later time?
And they also have young C14 ages. The number of creationists have had dinosaur bones tested for C14, and those
sure he's referring back
the
to the
ages that come back are much younger than this roughly 50,000 years radiocarbon years that we find for other fossil material.
Got it? By the way, this could also, potentially have some value in explaining the carbon-14 found in diamonds as well, because that's another big thing that young Earth creationists point to is, diamonds being so ancient, they shouldn't have any carbon-14 in it. But if there's nitrogen, which there's going to be nitrogen in small inclusions in a diamond, that nitrogen also can be changed into carbon-14 if there's as Dr. Baumgartner just said, if there is uranium that is decaying, giving off neutrons in the area. So that's going to create a constant new source of carbon-14 in samples that are very, very ancient. I'm not saying this is going to be a large amount. We're not talking about trillions of carbon, 14s in these samples. But as long as there is some carbon-14 there, you're going to have an instrument. You're going to increase the chances that your instrument is going to sense some carbon-14 presence. And therefore, you're going to have a ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12. And if you get any ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, your sample is not ever going to come out being calculated to be millions of years old. It has to be hundreds of thousands, if not much less than that. So this is not shocking stuff to anybody who's worked with carbon-14. And the scientific community is well aware of all these different types of sources of error. And that's why we wouldn't trust anything that gave a much larger number than that. That's why carbon-14 is not an appropriate form of analysis to be used to study things that potentially are hundreds of millions of years old. You're going to get the same dates essentially for everything that's more than 100,000 years old. Okay, well, that's really all I wanted to cover. I just found this to be an interesting revelation by this group. And you saw Andrew Snelling there agreed. He agreed that was, he was nodding his head, that he agrees that is a reason why we're still finding carbon-14. Now, of course, I'm sure that he believes that there's a nascent original carbon-14 still present, because these bones are only 4,000 350 years old. That's not even one half-life. You know, that means that more than half of all the radiocarbon that was originally present should still be there after just 4,350 years, the time in which the dinosaurs were preserved in a global flood. You know, they go through this whole thing where there's more carbon-12 in the past than there was in the present, and they try to rig the ratios such that they're expecting more carbon-14 than anybody else does. So it's an interesting message we have here, that they're acknowledging that there are ways that carbon-14 can be made. Now they're going to go on to kind of like brush the extra carbon-14 that's made by these other processes and say that doesn't make enough to then create the young ages. Like they're saying these are still too young. They should be older, even with the creation of like some background carbon-14 constantly being made, even in old objects. I think they're still expecting to be more. But again, you have to add on the error from the instrument, plus you're adding on ancient carbon, well, not ancient carbon, you're adding on new carbon-14 that's being produced in these objects. You put all that together and you're going to get dates that are going to be somewhere in the range of 40,000 to 70,000 years, even in an object that is 60 million years versus one that actually is 60,000 years old. Okay, that's all I've got. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.